It started as an ordinary flight. A black woman, calm and collected, boarded her plane, ready for a smooth journey home. But what unfolded in the next few minutes left the entire cabin in stunned silence. As she politely asked for a glass of water, the flight attendant's response shocked everyone. The tone was sharp, dismissive, and louder than necessary. "You'll have to wait until I'm ready," the flight attendant snapped, turning heads across the cabin. The woman didn't raise her voice. Instead, she offered a calm, measured response, "Of course." But something shifted in the room. Passengers exchanged uneasy glances. The tension was palpable. What happened just 3 minutes later, however, changed everything. The senior flight attendant, having overheard the interaction, stepped in quietly but decisively. The rude attendant was called to the front, and whispers began to ripple through the cabin. By the end of the flight, roles had reversed, and the once dismissive flight attendant found herself under scrutiny. The passengers who witnessed the exchange rallied behind the black woman, offering their support in ways both subtle and bold. When the plane landed, she walked off with her head held high, knowing she had handled the situation with grace. Stay tuned because what happened next sparked a conversation that no one could have predicted. This is a story you need to hear. Let us know where you're watching from today and if this story resonates with you. Don't forget to subscribe for more impactful moments like this. The airport had the kind of hum that settled deep into a person's bones, constant. Like the distant echo of a restless city. Ruth sat quietly at gate B27, hands folded over the soft leather of her carry-on bag. She had chosen a seat by the window. Not for the view but for the thin slice of space it gave her away from the crowd. Airports had a way of pressing people too close, folding them into one another like pages in a well-worn book. Ruth wasn't one to be read so easily. She watched the passengers milling about, the families herding restless children, the businessmen typing furiously into their phones, the couples leaning into whispered conversations. The world moved around her, but Ruth remained still, the quiet center of a wheel spinning faster than anyone realized. A boarding pass rested lightly between her fingers, its corners bent from being checked and rechecked. Memphis, it read. Flight 27. She wasn't nervous about flying. No, Ruth had flown more times than she could count. But there was a particular heaviness in the air today, the kind that made her notice things she might have otherwise let pass. When the flight attendant arrived to announce boarding, Ruth rose to her feet and fell in line. The woman taking tickets was thin, severe, her hair pulled back so tightly it looked as though she wore her authority as a crown. Ruth stepped forward, meeting the woman's gaze briefly as she handed over her pass. The attendant barely looked at her. Next, it wasn't the word itself that pricked Ruth's skin, but the sharpness behind it, the way the woman's eyes had flicked past her as if she weren't quite there. Ruth had seen that look before. It was the look that said, "I see you, but I'm choosing not to." She smiled anyway. "Thank you," Ruth said. The attendant didn't reply. Ruth's mother had taught her long ago that grace didn't cost anything, but withholding it could leave a debt that built up over time. People thought racism was loud, something that arrived in shouts and snarls. But Ruth knew better. The quiet kind where a smile was withheld or a glance skipped over you like a stone across water was the sort that lingered longest. The plane was cold when Ruth stepped inside. She found her seat by the window, settled in, and let her gaze drift over the faces filing in behind her. A man in the aisle across from her struggled with his seatbelt, his fingers trembling slightly as he fumbled with the metal clasp. He was older, with the heavy hands of someone who had worked with them his entire life. Ruth watched as the same flight attendant who had dismissed her at the gate appeared beside him. "Sir, I've explained this," she said, her voice clipped. "It's simple, like this." The man nodded quickly, but his hands betrayed him. Fumbling once more, Ruth opened her mouth, but the attendant's eyes flicked toward her. And for a second, just a second, there was something colder beneath the surface. "Let it go," the glance said. Ruth folded her hands over her lap, but the weight in her chest settled a little heavier. It was a small thing, the way Ruth asked for water. "Could I have a glass of water, please?" she asked softly, as the flight attendant passed by. But the woman's tray jolted slightly as she stopped, her eyes narrowing at Ruth as if she had asked for something far greater. "You'll have to wait until I reach your row," she said, the sharpness in her voice slicing through the hum of the plane. "Of course," Ruth replied. She hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't leaned forward, but heads turned anyway, and Ruth felt the heat of their eyes. The plane hadn't left the ground, but already Ruth could feel the turbulence building. The plane settled into the air the way an old house settles into the night, creaking slightly, but firm in its bones. Ruth sat still, her eyes resting on the soft blue of the horizon outside her window. The cabin lights had dimmed, but there was no mistaking the atmosphere that clung to the space between passengers like an unwelcome guest. She wasn't the only one who felt it. Across the aisle, the elderly man who had struggled with his seatbelt now sat quietly, his hands folded over his stomach. There was something about the way he stared at the seat ahead of him that made Ruth's chest ache, a stillness that looked a little too much like surrender. Her flight attendant was moving briskly down the aisle again, tray in hand, lips pressed into that same tight line Ruth had seen earlier. When she reached the couple seated 2 rows ahead, Ruth couldn't help but notice how quickly the woman's posture changed. "Anything to drink?" the attendant asked. Her voice was light, almost cheerful. The couple smiled in return, bright, unburdened smiles, and Ruth could hear the warmth in their reply. "Just water, please." The tray moved without hesitation. But when the same flight attendant approached Ruth's row, the air seemed to shift, as if the ground beneath their feet had tilted slightly. "And for you?" It wasn't an offer. It was closer to an obligation. Something said because it had to be said. Ruth glanced at the glass of water in her hand, half empty now, and shook her head softly. "No, thank you." The flight attendant didn't nod or acknowledge her in any way. She simply moved on, her tray clattering faintly as she passed by. It would have been easy to let it pass. Ruth could have turned her eyes back to the horizon, back to the fading sunlight that painted the clouds in soft strokes. But something about the interaction left a weight that refused to lift. She wasn't alone. The man across the aisle shifted in his seat, tilting his head slightly toward Ruth. His voice barely broke the hum of the engines. "It's not just you." Ruth met his gaze. His eyes were tired but kind, lined with the creases of someone who had seen far more than he cared to remember. "You noticed it too," Ruth said, keeping her voice low. He gave a small nod. "They always think we don't." A sharp voice broke the quiet a few rows behind them. "If you can't follow instructions, maybe you shouldn't be flying." Ruth turned her head just in time to see the flight attendant standing over a young couple. The woman had shifted in her seat, her tray table halfway down. The flight attendant's gaze pinned them in place. "We haven't even served dinner yet," the young woman stammered. "I thought it's policy." The attendant interrupted, straightening up. "The table stays up until we tell you otherwise." Ruth watched the couple exchange an uneasy glance. The young man reached for the tray, snapping it back into place with hurried hands. The flight attendant lingered a beat too long, her eyes trailing over them the way one might inspect a scuff on a shoe. "Thank you," she said coldly, before turning away. It wasn't until Ruth caught the man's gaze again that she realized how tense her shoulders had become. "Some people wear their power like armor," the man across the aisle said quietly. Ruth exhaled slowly. "And some wield it like a weapon." He gave a soft chuckle at that, the kind that wasn't born of humor but recognition. "You planning to say something?" he asked, his brow lifting slightly. Ruth looked toward the front of the cabin, where the senior flight attendant, the one with the graying hair and kind eyes, was speaking softly to a passenger with a child. His presence was different, calm in a way that soothed the edges of the room. "Maybe not yet," Ruth replied, "but soon." The man nodded in quiet agreement. "Let me know when you do. I'll back you up." It was a small thing, but Ruth felt the weight in the air shift ever so slightly. Sometimes, all it took was one person to remind her she wasn't alone. The plane settled into its cruising altitude, but the tension in the cabin never quite leveled out. It sat there thin, stretched tight across the rows like a wire pulled just enough to hum, but not break. Ruth could feel it, that electric thread running just beneath the polite conversations and hushed voices. It lived in the glances people exchanged when the flight attendant passed by, in the way shoulders stiffened when she stopped at a row. Ruth had known that tension before. She had known it sitting in the back of classrooms where her hand stayed raised too long before the teacher called on her. She had known it on city streets where crossing a certain line could shift the air, where her very presence was often answered with narrowed eyes and tight lips. She thought of her father, how he used to say, It's not always about the words, baby. It's about the silence that follows. And here, silence followed everywhere the flight attendant went. It wasn't just the couple with the tray table or the elderly man fumbling with his seatbelt. The woman 2 rows ahead, the one with the toddler squirming in her lap, had asked for an extra napkin and been met with a glare sharp enough to freeze water. A teenage boy, headphones resting around his neck, had dared to request a second cup of soda and received nothing but a curt, "You've had enough." None of these were grand offenses. There was no shouting, no slurs, nothing to pin directly to the ground and call by its name. But Ruth recognized the pattern the way that kind of casual dismissal always seemed to land on the same people. She wondered if the flight attendant noticed it, or if it was simply the water she swam in. The man across the aisle caught Ruth's gaze again. "She's working hard to remind us of our place," he said, low enough that no one else could hear. Ruth nodded slightly, her lips pressing into a thin line. "It's funny," she replied. "I didn't know asking for water could make me forget it." His laughter came soft but full, like the wind moving through leaves. Ruth tilted her head toward the flight attendant moving down the aisle. Her steps brisk, calculated. "It's always the small things," she said. "That's how they keep their hands clean." The next moment was inevitable. It always was. A man in the row ahead, broad shoulders, dark suit, leaned over to catch the flight attendant's attention. "Ma'am, could I trouble you for an extra blanket?" he asked. Polite but firm. She stopped cold. "You already have one," she said without looking at him. "It's a long flight," he replied, his voice calm. "I'm just asking." Her hand gripped the cart handle a little tighter. "There's enough for everyone," she snapped. "I can't hand out extras." Ruth watched the man's face shift, the flicker of something restrained behind his eyes. He exhaled, sitting back slowly, but Ruth could see it, the weight he swallowed whole, the way it settled in his chest. This is how it happens, Ruth thought, one needle at a time until you're holding your breath just to avoid the next prick. But the problem with needles is that eventually, you bleed. Ruth didn't say anything right away. She sat with it, let it breathe. But as the flight attendant passed by her row, Ruth's voice cut through the quiet like the soft edge of a blade. "Excuse me," she said, calm as the ocean before a storm. The flight attendant stopped. "Yes?" Ruth met her eyes, steady and unwavering. "That gentleman wasn't asking for much," she said, gesturing toward the man in the suit. "Surely there's another blanket somewhere on this plane." The flight attendant's face hardened, but Ruth held her gaze. "This isn't your concern," the attendant replied, her voice colder now. "Isn't it?" Ruth asked, tilting her head slightly. "Seems to me it concerns everyone here." A hush settled around them. The man across the aisle leaned forward, his expression unreadable but watchful. "I can wait for the report," Ruth said softly, almost to herself. "It won't be the first time I've written one." There it was, the flicker of hesitation in the attendant's eyes, the way her grip shifted just slightly on the handle. Ruth didn't have to raise her voice. She just had to let her silence sit long enough for the rest of the cabin to feel it too. There is a way people respond to discomfort that is older than memory itself. Some turn away from it, folding into the soft corners of silence. Others press forward, headlong, wearing their defiance like armor. And then there are those people like Ruth who let the weight of it settle in their bones, carrying it quietly until the moment calls for release. She had been carrying this weight long before she stepped onto that plane. The flight attendant lingered at the edge of the row, her knuckles pale against the handle of the service cart. Ruth didn't need to look around to know that the exchange had drawn eyes from every direction. There's a shift that happens when silence is broken, the soft intake of breath, the subtle leaning forward of bodies, the collective pause that suggests something more than politeness is at play. The man across the aisle said nothing, but Ruth could feel the quiet gravity of his gaze. "Is there a problem?" the flight attendant asked, though her tone made clear she wasn't expecting an answer. Ruth met her eyes, steady and calm. "I asked a simple question," Ruth said. "Seems to me a blanket shouldn't be too much trouble." The attendant's jaw tightened, a small thing, but noticeable in the close quarters of the cabin. "We have policies for a reason," she replied. "I'm following them." Ruth offered the smallest of smiles, though there was nothing warm about it. "I understand policies," Ruth said. "I've lived under them my entire life." A few rows ahead, the young couple from earlier, the ones who had been chastised over their tray table, glanced back. their eyes flickering between Ruth and the attendant. It wasn't lost on anyone how differently rules seemed to be applied depending on who was asking. The next moments stretched longer than they should have. The attendant didn't move. Neither did Ruth. It wasn't that Ruth expected the blanket to suddenly materialize. It wasn't even about the blanket anymore. It was about the sound of her own voice, steady, firm, cutting through the air, refusing to be smoothed over or dismissed. But Ruth also knew the game. If there's one thing life had taught her, it was that some people aren't accustomed to being questioned. The weight of even the smallest challenge feels like a crack forming beneath their feet. And people will do anything to avoid falling through. "Would you like me to speak to someone else?" Ruth asked. Her voice wasn't raised, but the meaning in her words hung like smoke. The attendant's eyes narrowed slightly. But Ruth caught the hesitation, the briefest flicker of doubt. That's how it always started. The thing about power, Ruth thought, is that it shifts the moment people realize they aren't the only ones holding it. Ruth wasn't sure who spoke first. Maybe it was the older man behind her, whose voice broke gently across the aisle like the first drops of rain before a storm. "She's right," he said simply, his words low but clear. And just like that, the thread began to pull. The mother with the toddler, silent until now, nodded faintly, glancing up from where she sat rocking her child to sleep. "I don't think anyone's asking for much," she said quietly. Even the teenager with the headphones, who hadn't said a word the entire flight, lowered them around his neck. "She's been snapping at everyone," he muttered. "We all see it." The attendant's posture straightened, rigid now, defensive. Ruth could see it happening in real time. The slow unraveling of authority. "That's enough," the attendant said sharply, but her voice betrayed the faintest tremor. Ruth didn't move. "I think it's only just beginning," she replied. "There are moments when the ground shifts beneath you, not with the force of an earthquake, but with the subtle shift of tide beneath the moon." This was one of those moments. The senior flight attendant appeared at the front of the cabin, his gaze sweeping slowly over the rows, as if he could feel the temperature rising. Ruth didn't call out to him. She didn't need to. The man across the aisle lifted his hand slightly, waving the senior attendant over. When he arrived, Ruth leaned forward, her voice low and calm. "I believe there's been a misunderstanding," she said. The senior attendant crouched slightly, his face level with Ruth's. "I see," he said. "What seems to be the trouble?" Ruth let the weight of the last half hour settle between them before she spoke. "I think you already know." The older man behind her gave a small nod. "She's been rude to half the plane," he added, his voice tired but resolute. The senior attendant's eyes flicked toward his colleague, the flight attendant now standing stiff as stone, her gaze fixed somewhere just above Ruth's head. The senior attendant sighed, rising slowly to his feet. "Thank you for letting me know," he said, his voice quiet but heavy with meaning. It was a small victory. But Ruth knew better than to underestimate the small ones. That's how it always started, one voice. Then another. And another. A crack in the ceiling. The hum of the engines filled the space where words had been left to hang. The flight attendant, rigid as steel, stood frozen in the aisle, her eyes trained forward as if she could will herself out of the moment. But moments like these have a way of refusing to pass quietly. They linger, stretch out, demand to be felt. Ruth sat back in her seat, her gaze steady and deliberate. She had no intention of pressing further. She didn't need to. The silence that followed had already done the heavy lifting. What unsettled the flight attendant, Ruth suspected, wasn't the words spoken to her, but the realization that others had been watching and waiting for someone else to say what they'd been holding under their breath. It's always the weight of watching eyes that tips the scale. The senior flight attendant lingered, crouched by Ruth's row, but his attention drifted elsewhere toward the rows ahead, the faces peeking over seats, and the sharp, quiet unity that now threaded its way through the cabin. "Thank you for bringing this to my attention," he said, his voice low enough to suggest that he was speaking to Ruth, but loud enough for the flight attendant to hear. Ruth nodded but didn't say another word. When the senior flight attendant rose and disappeared toward the galley, the woman beside Ruth shifted uncomfortably. She hadn't spoken during the exchange but now leaned slightly toward Ruth as if drawn by some invisible strain. "You handled that well," she whispered. "I'm not sure I could have." Ruth smiled faintly, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "You could have," Ruth replied. "You just didn't have to be the first one." The woman nodded, her gaze flickering briefly toward the flight attendant. who now busied herself further down the aisle, her sharpness dulled beneath the quiet tension still hanging in the cabin. The man across the aisle leaned in slightly. "Funny thing," he said softly, his voice just above a breath. "I've been flying for years. And I can always tell when it's going to go this way." Ruth met his gaze. "So can I." The man chuckled under his breath. "It's not something they put in the safety manual, is it?" "No," Ruth replied, tilting her head slightly, "but you learn the pattern quick enough. It wasn't just this flight attendant. It wasn't just this flight. The script had been written long before any of them boarded the plane." A woman in authority, a uniform pressed sharp enough to cut, felt the need to remind certain passengers of their place. Not loudly, not directly, but with the quiet precision of a blade sliding beneath skin. It was about who was granted ease and who had to earn it. Who was offered grace without question, and who was made to bleed for it. A ripple passed through the rows when the flight attendant returned to the aisle. Her movements were quicker now. Brisk, as if by speeding up she could outrun the weight pressing against her back. Passengers who had once shrunk into their seats now watched her with an unflinching stillness that made the space feel smaller. Heavier. Ruth knew that feeling well. The attendant paused by a young couple near the middle of the cabin. The woman, barely out of her 20s, sat with her hands folded neatly in her lap while the man beside her glanced up from his phone. "You need to move your bag," the attendant said. Her voice clipped. The young woman blinked. "It's under my seat." "Not far enough under," the attendant replied, eyes narrowing slightly. "FAA regulations." The man beside her straightened in his seat. "It's not blocking anything. It's still policy," the attendant snapped. A thin hush spread across the aisle. Ruth glanced across at the older man again, who exhaled sharply through his nose. "See what I mean?" he muttered. By now, the tone of the plane had shifted. It wasn't just discomfort anymore, it was collective recognition. A quiet, unspoken acknowledgement that this wasn't about policy, but about power. Ruth tapped her fingers lightly against the armrest, letting the moment stretch long enough for the weight to settle. The attendant moved on, but her pace betrayed her. She knew she'd lost them. The thing Ruth understood better than most was that racism didn't often show up dressed in its Sunday best. It wasn't loud or theatrical. It didn't arrive with slurs or fists. No, most days. It dressed like this: a tightened jaw, a lingering pause, a rule applied too strictly, too precisely. It showed up in the way some people were asked to move their bags while others left theirs untouched. In the way some were offered second cups of coffee without asking, while others were denied water the first time. It was ordinary, familiar, and that was precisely what made it so dangerous. The flight attendant didn't speak to Ruth again, not for the remainder of the flight, but Ruth could feel the shift in her presence the way she avoided looking directly at her. The stiffness that now clung to her movements. It was a small thing, but small things have a way of planting themselves deeply in the cracks people try so hard to cover. The senior flight attendant passed by Ruth's row once more before the descent. Pausing briefly, "Thank you again," he said softly, with a nod. Ruth nodded in return. She didn't need to say much. The weight of watching eyes had done the work for her. Some cracks take years to break the surface. Others show up right away, no matter how hard people try to ignore them. The descent began with the quiet flicker of the seatbelt sign, but the tension in the cabin had already settled into place long before that. The hum of the engines felt louder now, pressing against the thin layer of calm stretched across the rows like old glass, fragile, waiting for the wrong word to shatter it. Ruth sat still, her hands resting lightly in her lap. She could feel the pulse of the plane beneath her feet. But what held her attention wasn't the ground approaching below. It was the space around her. The flight attendant hadn't returned. Not since that last stiff exchange. Not since the air had shifted in a way that made it impossible for her to move through the cabin with the same quiet authority she had clung to at the start of the flight. Power slips in silence, Ruth thought, and the shape of silence had changed. Ruth had lived long enough to know that silence carries different weight depending on who's holding it. Some wear it like a shield, letting it protect them, keep them hidden. Others let it sit inside them, filling the cracks left by years of small, sharpened moments like these. She remembered the first time she felt it, standing with her father outside a restaurant that wouldn't seat them, his hand resting on her shoulder. Firm but calm. "They don't want us here," he'd said softly, but his voice carried no shame. Just fact. Why not? Ruth had asked, barely past the age of 10, squinting at the half-empty tables inside. Her father had smiled then, but not the kind that came from joy. They don't need to explain it, he had said, because we already know. She thought of that now, watching the flight attendant move briskly at the front of the plane, keeping herself busy with the last few checks before landing. The woman hadn't said anything more to Ruth, but she didn't need to. Ruth could see the shape of the apology she refused to give. The weight of 1,000 unspoken words stitched into the seams of her uniform. The man across the aisle caught Ruth's eye again. She's been awful quiet, he said, tipping his head toward the flight attendant. Ruth nodded. They always are, when they realize it's too late to fix it. He chuckled softly under his breath, but there was no joy in it. Funny how that works, he said. You spend enough years biting your tongue, you learn to see it coming. Ruth leaned back against her seat, letting the faint vibration of the plane run through her spine. It's not just this flight, she replied. It never is. The man shifted slightly, his face thoughtful as he gazed out over the rows ahead. No, he agreed, it's not. Somewhere near the back of the plane, a child's voice broke the quiet sharp, sudden, followed by the soft murmurs of a tired mother trying to hush him. The flight attendant glanced in their direction, her mouth pressing into a thin line. For a brief moment, Ruth saw the flicker of irritation rise in her eyes, the way her fingers curled just slightly against the handle of the cart she'd been pushing toward the galley. But she didn't speak, not this time. Ruth could see it saw how the flight attendant swallowed it down, choking on the weight of a room that had already turned against her. That's the thing about moments like this, Ruth thought. They have a way of leaving cracks wide enough for people to fall into if they aren't careful. And once the room knows those cracks are there, it watches. The senior flight attendant passed through the aisle one final time, pausing near Ruth's row. I appreciate your patience, he said softly, crouching just enough so that his words didn't carry further than necessary. Ruth looked up at him, her expression even. Patience isn't the problem, she replied, but I appreciate the acknowledgement. The man nodded, his face lined with something Ruth recognized: understanding. Maybe. Or the quiet burden carried by those who had stood in rooms where they were outnumbered but not outmatched. I'll make sure this doesn't go unnoticed, he added, his voice lowering just slightly. Ruth smiled faintly. I know you will. As he straightened and continued toward the back of the plane, Ruth let her gaze linger on the woman still stationed near the galley. The flight attendant's eyes darted to Ruth for just a second, brief but heavy. Ruth held the gaze, letting it sit between them long enough to make clear that she had seen all she needed to see. It wasn't anger Ruth felt. Not anymore. It was something sharper. Pity. As the wheels touched the ground and the plane rolled slowly toward the gate, Ruth watched the passengers around her gather their things, the tension beginning to dissolve into the familiar shuffling and soft voices of arrival. The man across the aisle didn't move right away. He sat there, watching Ruth carefully as if weighing something unsaid. You travel often? He asked finally, his voice soft but steady. Ruth nodded, enough to know how these things go. He smiled faintly. I thought so. As the plane came to a full stop and the seatbelt sign flicked off, the flight attendant moved swiftly toward the exit, her posture stiff but hurried. She didn't look at Ruth again, but Ruth watched her walk away, knowing she'd left something behind. That's the thing about power, Ruth thought. Once it slips, it's hard to gather it all back. And sometimes, the room remembers long after you've left it. The plane exhaled as the doors opened, the stale air inside rushing out as if even the aircraft itself had been holding something back. Passengers gathered their bags, murmuring softly as they filed into the narrow aisle. Ruth remained seated, watching the line move forward in small, uneven steps. She had no reason to hurry. The airport wasn't going anywhere. The man across the aisle stood slowly, taking his time to lift his carry-on from the overhead bin. His fingers wrapped firmly around the handle, but he didn't move forward right away. Instead, he glanced down at Ruth, his brow furrowed slightly. You've got a way about you, he said. Ruth looked up, meeting his gaze. How's that? The man shrugged, but there was something in his eyes, a quiet kind of admiration. The sort that comes from recognizing an old, familiar strength. You speak in a way that makes people listen, he said simply, but you don't raise your voice. Ruth smiled faintly. I've learned that raising your voice isn't always the loudest way to speak. He nodded, stepping aside to let her into the aisle. Seems like she learned that too, he muttered, tipping his head toward the front of the plane. The flight attendant stood by the exit now, her eyes fixed ahead, stiff as a marble statue. Ruth rose, gathering her bag. She learned something, Ruth replied softly, but I'm not sure she knows what to do with it yet. The aisle narrowed as Ruth approached the front, and for a brief moment, the space seemed to shrink even further. The flight attendant was right there, close enough that Ruth could feel the tension pressing off her like heat from a flame. Her eyes flicked toward Ruth, but only for a second, darting away as though holding the gaze too long might cost her something. Ruth wasn't sure if the woman's stiffness came from anger or shame. Maybe both, but Ruth didn't flinch. "Thank you," she said calmly as she passed. Her words carried no weight beyond what they needed to, but she let them linger just long enough to be felt. The attendant's lips pressed into a thin line. "Have a good day," the woman replied, her voice strained but polite, carefully stitched together for the sake of appearances. Ruth didn't respond. She didn't need to. Stepping into the terminal felt like emerging from deep water. The air was cooler, lighter, and passengers scattered quickly, dispersing toward connecting flights or baggage claim. Ruth walked at an easy pace, the wheels of her carry-on clicking softly against the polished floor. The man from the aisle fell into step beside her, his hands tucked into the pockets of his jacket. "She'll remember you," he said. Ruth glanced at him, her expression thoughtful. "I wasn't trying to be remembered." "I know," he replied, "but that's usually how it works, isn't it? It's the people who don't go looking for trouble that end up being the ones remembered most." Ruth let out a soft breath. "It wasn't trouble," she said. "It was necessary." The man smiled, small but genuine. "Same thing, sometimes." As they neared baggage claim, the crowd thinned further, and the hum of the airport softened into something closer to stillness. The man paused, glancing toward Ruth as he shifted his bag over his shoulder. "I guess this is where I head off," he said, "but I'm glad I sat near you today." Ruth smiled gently. "Likewise." He hesitated for a moment, as if weighing something unsaid, but then offered his hand. Ruth shook it firmly. "You keep carrying yourself the way you do," he said. "The world needs more of it." Ruth held his gaze, recognizing the deeper meaning beneath his words, the kind that existed between people who had spent lifetimes walking the same thin lines, carrying the same silent burdens. "I'll do my best," she replied, as Ruth waited by the carousel, watching bags tumble down onto the belt. She caught her reflection in the glass beyond the terminal windows. The woman staring back at her looked calm still, but Ruth knew the weight beneath the surface. She had felt it for years. It wasn't the confrontation that stayed with her, nor the brief exchange of words. It was the knowledge that this moment would repeat itself. In different forms, in different rooms, somewhere else. Another Ruth would sit quietly by a window seat. Another attendant would draw the same lines, wear the same armor, and tilt the scales in ways so subtle they could almost deny it. Almost. But today, the weight had shifted, even if just by a hair. And sometimes, Ruth thought, a hair's width was enough to let the light through. The carousel groaned under the weight of circling luggage. One by one, travelers peeled their bags from the belt, moving on without ceremony. Ruth waited, her fingers lightly gripping the handle of her carry-on, eyes scanning the slow parade of suitcases. She wasn't in a rush. Airports, she had learned, are places where patience holds a kind of quiet power. The man from the aisle had disappeared into the stream of passengers. A few others from the flight passed by, offering small nods of recognition. There was no need for words. Acknowledgement hung between them, subtle but felt. Still, the weight of the flight lingered in Ruth's chest like smoke in the rafters long after the fire had burned out. Her bag slid onto the carousel, scuffed but intact. She pulled it free and turned toward the exit, blending into the crowd funneling toward the automatic doors. The city outside waited, bright and indifferent, but Ruth's steps slowed as she approached the glass. Through the terminal's reflection, she spotted the flight attendant. Not the senior one, the other. She stood near a different carousel, arms crossed over her chest, eyes darting around the room but never settling anywhere. There was something strained in the way she stood, like a child forced to wait outside the principal's office, uncertain of the verdict to come. Ruth paused, watching her in the glass. The attendant didn't notice Ruth at first, but when their eyes finally met in the reflection, There was no mistaking the flicker of recognition that passed between them. It was brief, but it carried weight. The attendant's gaze shifted quickly. But Ruth didn't look away. Ruth wasn't angry. She hadn't been angry for a long time. Anger, she had learned, is fleeting, a fire that burns hot but fades quickly. What remains is something colder, harder to extinguish. She had seen this look before, worn by strangers who had crossed paths with her in hotels, banks, department stores. The look of someone who suddenly realized the power they had leaned on wasn't quite as sturdy as they thought. There's a ghost that follows people like that, Ruth thought. It's not the ghost of the person they wronged. It's the ghost of the silence that follows when no one else says anything. But this time, there was no silence. Ruth considered walking over, saying something simple, polite, but she stayed rooted to the spot, letting the weight of the moment settle between them. Some distances aren't meant to be crossed. The flight attendant looked away, pretending to scan the room, but Ruth could see the stiffness in her shoulders, the tension she carried even as she tried to appear unaffected. Ruth wasn't cruel. She felt no satisfaction in watching the woman shrink beneath the weight of something she had so freely given to others just hours before. But Ruth also knew that lessons are rarely learned in comfort. As Ruth stepped through the sliding doors, the air outside hit her, a cool breeze cutting through the humid city night. She exhaled, watching her breath curl into the air before disappearing. She thought of the others on that flight, the man across the aisle, the woman with the child, the elderly man who had struggled with his seatbelt. Their faces stayed with her, woven into the fabric of the day. Change, Ruth knew, doesn't arrive with fanfare. It doesn't burst through the doors demanding attention. It seeps in quietly through the smallest cracks, the moments no one expects to matter. A word spoken calmly in the face of dismissal, a nod exchanged between strangers, a flight attendant stiffening beneath the gaze of someone who refused to be made small. Ruth hailed a taxi, sliding into the backseat and resting her head lightly against the window as the city lights stretched past in long, golden streaks. As the car rolled through the streets, she thought again of the reflection in the terminal glass, the brief, flickering moment when two sets of eyes met, and the balance of power shifted just slightly. It wasn't victory, but it was something. And sometimes, Ruth thought, something is enough to make sure the silence doesn't return so easily. It was supposed to be a simple flight home. Malcolm Green, a decorated Army veteran, stepped into the crowded airport terminal, his duffel bag slung over his shoulder, his uniform still crisp from deployment. But what happened next would expose a truth many choose to ignore, and within minutes, the entire airport was watching. As Malcolm approached security, a TSA officer's eyes narrowed. The line moved smoothly until it was Malcolm's turn. Suddenly, everything slowed. "Step aside," the officer said, loud enough for heads to turn. At first, Malcolm thought nothing of it. Routine checks weren't unusual. But the way the officer's gaze lingered told him otherwise. "You travel often?" the officer asked, inspecting Malcolm's passport longer than necessary. "Yes, sir," Malcolm replied calmly, "just returning home." But it wasn't the words that mattered. It was the silence that followed. A second officer joined, whispering quietly before addressing Malcolm with that familiar weight of suspicion that needs no explanation. "We need to check your bag." Malcolm's heart steadied, but he felt the shift, the eyes now watching him, the uneasy glances exchanged by nearby passengers. A soldier returning from duty. Yet somehow, he still wasn't trusted in his own country. He complied without protest, but the officer's hands dug too long, too deep, as if searching for something they hoped to find. Then, a voice broke the tension. "Is there a problem here?" An older man, white, with silver hair and a veteran's pin on his jacket, stood nearby. Watching the scene unfold, his question wasn't loud, but it was enough to stall the officer's hands. "No problem," the officer muttered. But there was, because what happened next wasn't part of the script. Within minutes, the TSA officer was pulled aside by his supervisor, replaced, and quietly escorted away. Malcolm zipped his bag, offering the older man a respectful nod. "Thank you," Malcolm said. The man smiled faintly. "Welcome home, soldier." But the moment wasn't just about Malcolm. It was about every person who had been made to feel small in spaces that promised equality. It was a reminder that sometimes, the smallest act of standing up ripples further than you think. Stay with me, because what happened after Malcolm's flight landed will surprise you even more.